Stop. Stop blaming your bladder for waking you up at 2 or 3 in the morning. Just stop. Because what you're about to hear changes everything about the way you understand nighttime sleep disruption after 40, 50, or 60. I'm Dr. John Marston, and after more than 3 decades as a vascular and metabolic surgeon, I have stood over operating tables holding arteries that look 20 years older than the patient attached to them, and I have watched perfectly intelligent, disciplined people slowly decline because of a process that began with something as simple as waking up every night at the same hour. You think those awakenings are just part of getting older. You're wrong. What I want to show you tonight is what is actually happening inside your body when your eyes suddenly open at 2:17 a.m. Your heart is racing slightly, and you feel oddly alert instead of sleepy. By the time I finish walking you through this case, you will never look at nighttime waking the same way again. When Robert arrived at my operating table, his blood pressure had surged so violently during the night that it triggered a vascular emergency. 67 years old. Recently retired engineer, walked 3 miles a day, followed his doctor's advice exactly. But to understand how Robert ended up on that operating table, we have to rewind 2 years earlier, when the only symptom he noticed was waking up every single night at almost the same time, usually between 2 and 3 in the morning. He assumed it was normal aging. His doctor assumed the same. What nobody told Robert was that every single one of those awakenings was the visible signal of a hormonal ambush happening deep inside his nervous system. The culprit is cortisol, the body's primary stress hormone, and at night it is supposed to be silent. In a healthy circadian rhythm, cortisol drops after sunset and stays low while the body enters its most critical repair phases: deep sleep, blood pressure stabilization, memory consolidation, cellular repair. That's when the body rebuilds muscle fibers, repairs vascular tissue, and recalibrates the brain. But when cortisol rises during the night, the entire system shifts into emergency mode. Think of it like a military alarm being triggered inside a city that should be asleep. The sympathetic nervous system deploys instantly. Glucose floods into the bloodstream. Heart rate increases. Brain activity spikes. And suddenly the body that was supposed to be repairing itself is fighting a battle it doesn't even understand. I've seen the evidence directly in surgical tissue. Blood vessels stiffened, hormonal signaling disrupted. Not bad luck, not genetics. A nightly cortisol surge running for years without anyone recognizing it. Pause this video for a moment and think about the last week of your sleep. How many nights did you wake up at almost the same time? Write the number down, because I haven't told you the worst part yet. The awakening itself isn't the damage. It's just the alarm bell. The real damage is the mechanism triggering that alarm in the first place. And most people never realize it's happening until years later, when the consequences show up in blood pressure, memory decline, or cardiovascular disease. And the mechanism behind it is far more deceptive than anyone realizes. Now we start the investigation. When I operate on someone who has been waking up night after night for years, the evidence isn't abstract, it's physical. The blood vessels show chronic stress signaling. The nervous system markers are elevated. The metabolic pathways look like a battlefield that never stood down. And the first perpetrator in this case is something most people never suspect: nighttime blood sugar instability. Let me show you the chain of events, because this is where the mechanism begins to make sense. It starts with a drop in blood glucose during the night. That drop activates the hypothalamus in the brain, which interprets it as a potential survival threat. The hypothalamus immediately activates the HPA axis, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal cascade, and that cascade releases cortisol like an emergency flare into the bloodstream. Cortisol's job is simple: raise blood sugar quickly. It does this by forcing the liver to dump glucose into circulation through a process called gluconeogenesis. But here's the critical point most people never hear. Cortisol doesn't wake you up gently. It wakes you up like a fire alarm. Your heart rate increases. Your brain shifts into alert mode. The sympathetic nervous system, the fight-or-flight division, deploys instantly. Your body is now a fortress responding to what it believes is an invasion. Think of cortisol as a saboteur disguised as a rescue team. It looks like help, but it arrives with heavy artillery. Researchers documented this mechanism years ago. A study published in the Journal of Clinical Endocrinology and Metabolism tracked nighttime cortisol spikes in adults with sleep disruption. The finding was clear. Cortisol surges were associated with significant nighttime awakenings and sympathetic activation. Not a small signal, not a coincidence, a measurable endocrine event. Let me put that in real terms for you. If that surge happens occasionally, the body recovers. But if it happens every single night for years, the body never truly enters the deep repair stages of sleep. That means the cardiovascular system never fully resets, the brain never completes memory consolidation, and inflammatory signaling stays elevated. I saw this exact mechanism in Patricia, a 72-year-old retired teacher who came to see me after months of unexplained fatigue and nightly awakenings at 3 a.m. every single night. When we traced the timeline back, the pattern was clear. She ate dinner early, skipped any late evening nutrition, and her blood glucose dropped sharply during the night. The body interpreted that drop as danger. Cortisol surged. Her brain woke up instantly. She thought it was insomnia. It wasn't insomnia. It was a metabolic alarm system firing at the wrong time. But here's where the investigation deepens. Blood sugar instability is only the first layer. The second mechanism is even more subtle, and it involves the communication network between the gut, the brain, and the endocrine system, the gut-brain axis. This is where compounds like raw apple cider vinegar begin to matter, because certain gut microbes influence glucose signaling and hormonal rhythms. And when that system becomes disrupted, the nighttime cortisol alarm becomes even easier to trigger. But hold on, we're not at the deepest layer yet. Because there's a third mechanism linking the nervous system, inflammation pathways like NF-κB signaling, and the hormones that control sleep architecture itself. And once you see how those three mechanisms interact, the entire case changes. Now we reach the verdict stage of this investigation, and this is where the entire case changes, because the first two mechanisms, nighttime blood sugar instability and gut-brain signaling disruption, are not acting alone. There is a third mechanism, and in my operating room, it shows up like the final piece of evidence that explains everything else. Inflammatory signaling inside the nervous system itself. The specific pathway researchers often identify is called the NF-κB pathway, and it behaves like a war command center inside your cells. When NF-κB becomes chronically activated, the body shifts into a state of persistent alertness, even during hours when the nervous system should be shutting down. Think of it as a military headquarters that never receives the ceasefire order. The soldiers keep mobilizing, signals keep firing. Cortisol keeps getting deployed even when the battlefield is quiet. In the context of sleep, this means the brain becomes hypersensitive to metabolic signals like blood sugar drops or digestive stress. The result is that the cortisol alarm becomes easier to trigger night after night, sometimes for years before anyone realizes the pattern. I want you to pause this video for a moment and do something simple. Write down the exact time you most often wake up during the night. Not roughly, precisely, because that timing matters more than most people understand, and we'll come back to it in a moment. Now let me introduce you to Gerald, 74 years old, a retired construction manager who believed he had developed light sleep after retirement. When Gerald first came into the clinic, his primary complaint was simple. He woke up every night at 2:40 a.m., almost like clockwork. No pain, no anxiety attacks, just sudden alertness and an inability to return to deep sleep for nearly an hour. His doctors had suggested common explanations, aging, stress, maybe mild insomnia, but none of those explanations accounted for the precision of the timing. But to understand how Gerald reached that point, we have to rewind 18 months earlier. At that time, Gerald had begun experiencing small changes that seemed unrelated to sleep, slight muscle stiffness in the morning, occasional brain fog during the afternoon, a subtle increase in resting heart rate. These are exactly the kinds of signals people ignore because they appear minor. But underneath those small signals, the inflammatory cascade was already running. NF-QB signaling was activating immune responses that subtly interfered with neurotransmitters responsible for sleep stability, particularly gamma-aminobutyric acid, GABA, the primary inhibitory neurotransmitter that calms neural activity at night. When GABA signaling becomes weakened, the brain loses its ability to hold the deeper stages of sleep. Instead of maintaining slow-wave sleep, the brain drifts toward lighter stages where cortisol signals can break through. Now combine that vulnerability with the two earlier mechanisms we discussed. Blood sugar dips during the night. The hypothalamus interprets the dip as danger. The HPA axis fires cortisol. The inflammatory nervous system amplifies the signal. The brain wakes instantly. That is the three-mechanism chain: metabolic instability, gut-brain signaling disruption, and inflammatory neural activation. Once all three mechanisms align, nighttime awakenings stop being random events. They become predictable physiological responses. Researchers actually documented part of this chain in a study published in the Journal of Sleep Research. Adults experiencing fragmented sleep showed elevated inflammatory signaling markers and altered cortisol rhythms compared to individuals with stable sleep cycles. The difference was not subtle. It was measurable across multiple endocrine markers, not a suggestion, a pattern. And yet this finding has been sitting in the literature for years without changing how sleep disturbances are explained in most clinics. That's not conspiracy. That's the slow speed of institutional medicine catching up to complex metabolic science. Your doctor isn't wrong. Your doctor is working with an outdated map that treats sleep as a neurological issue instead of a metabolic hormonal network. Now here's the moment where this investigation shifts from evidence to agency, because once you understand the three mechanisms, you can also understand how they can be stabilized. When blood sugar remains steady through the night, cortisol has no reason to surge. When gut-brain signaling becomes balanced, metabolic alarms become less sensitive. When inflammatory signaling is reduced and GABA activity improves, the brain regains its ability to maintain deep sleep cycles. That is when something remarkable happens. The body begins to return to the natural circadian rhythm it was designed to follow. I have seen this transition repeatedly. Raymond, 69, experienced nightly awakenings for almost 3 years, every night at roughly 3 a.m. But when he began addressing all three mechanisms simultaneously, metabolic stability, gut-brain communication, and neural calming, the timing of those awakenings started shifting. First they occurred later in the night, then they became shorter. Eventually they disappeared altogether, not because of a sleeping pill, but because the underlying mechanism stopped triggering the cortisol alarm. Write this next sentence down because it is the turning point of the entire case. The absence of symptoms does not create healthy sleep, but stable physiology does. And that leads us to the next phase of this investigation, because I'm about to show you the exact protocol that addresses these three mechanisms simultaneously: blood sugar stability, gut-brain signaling, and neural calming. Not vague advice, the actual protocol. But before I reveal it, there is one more thing you need to understand about how these compounds work together inside the body. Now we reach the sentencing phase of this investigation, and this is where the protocol becomes clear. Everything I am about to explain ties directly back to the three mechanisms we uncovered: nighttime blood sugar instability, disruption of the gut-brain signaling network, and inflammatory nervous system activation that weakens deep sleep stability. This is not a random list of supplements. Each component has a specific job in the system. Component 1 addresses the first trigger in the chain: nighttime glucose instability. Raw apple cider vinegar, specifically the unfiltered variety containing the sediment known as the mother, has been studied for its ability to moderate blood glucose responses after meals. The mechanism involves delayed gastric emptying and improved insulin sensitivity, which reduces the likelihood of rapid blood sugar drops hours later during the night. The research-supported approach many clinicians discuss is approximately 1 tablespoon diluted in water before the evening meal, not after midnight, not randomly. Before dinner, when it can influence the metabolic response that carries into the night. Component 2 targets the neural calming mechanism through magnesium, particularly magnesium glycinate. Magnesium participates in hundreds of biochemical reactions, including regulation of GABA, the inhibitory neurotransmitter responsible for calming neural activity. When magnesium levels are insufficient, GABA signaling weakens, and the brain becomes more sensitive to cortisol signals during the night. Research examining magnesium supplementation in older adults has shown improvements in sleep efficiency and reduced nighttime awakenings in some individuals. The commonly discussed amount in sleep research ranges around 200–400 milligrams taken in the evening, though individual responses vary. Component 3 supports circadian rhythm signaling. Tart cherry products have drawn attention because they naturally contain melatonin along with anthocyanin antioxidants that influence inflammatory pathways related to sleep regulation. Some clinical trials examining tart cherry juice in adults with insomnia reported modest increases in total sleep time and improved sleep efficiency. The timing most often discussed in these studies is approximately 1 hour before bedtime, allowing the melatonin content to align with the body's natural sleep onset signals. Component 4 targets stress response signaling directly. Ashwagandha, an herb traditionally used in South Asian medicine systems, has been examined in modern clinical trials for its potential effects on perceived stress and cortisol levels. Some studies suggest that standardized extracts may help support a calmer physiological stress response when taken consistently over time. By moderating the stress signaling pathways, the likelihood of sudden nighttime cortisol activation may decrease. Component 5 focuses on metabolic stability during the night itself. Small amounts of natural honey before bedtime have been discussed in metabolic sleep research because the combination of glucose and fructose may support liver glycogen stores, which the brain relies on for stable overnight energy signaling. When liver glycogen drops too low, the brain may trigger cortisol to restore glucose levels. Supporting glycogen availability may reduce that signal. Finally, glycine, an amino acid involved in neurotransmitter activity and temperature regulation, has been studied for its ability to promote faster sleep onset and improved sleep quality when taken before bedtime. Glycine functions partly by promoting mild reductions in core body temperature and by supporting inhibitory signaling in the nervous system. Now I know what some of you are thinking. Your doctor may disagree with parts of this. That doesn't mean your doctor is wrong. It means sleep science spans multiple disciplines that traditional training sometimes addresses separately. Another question people often raise is cost. Compare the daily cost of dietary components or supplements to the consequences we discussed earlier. Years of fragmented sleep affecting cardiovascular health, cognition, and metabolic stability. The arithmetic becomes clear very quickly, and the final question is the one I hear most often. How do I know whether improving these mechanisms will help me? The honest answer is that individual biology always varies, but the physiological pathways involved, cortisol rhythms, glucose regulation, neurotransmitter balance, operate in every human nervous system. When those pathways stabilize, sleep architecture often stabilizes as well. Before you leave this video, leave a comment describing what time you most often wake up during the night. That single detail can reveal patterns many people never notice. Share this video with someone who complains about waking up every night at the same hour. Subscribe if you want to follow future investigations into how metabolism, hormones, and sleep interact. Because the next case we're examining looks at another hidden factor affecting sleep in adults over 50, the surprising connection between nighttime dehydration and cardiovascular stress signals during deep sleep.